Right, morning everybody. I'm going to hand you over to David, who's going to do a brief introduction of what this training is about. Obviously, some people are joining by teams. I think there's a couple of people joining by teams, but they have asked if you can just say your name if you've got any questions. So, because the names aren't coming up on the microphone, so instead of that, if you can just say your name when you want to speak and just raise your hand. Okay, thanks. Over to David.
Thank you, Chair. Morning, everybody. Thanks for your time today. So the purpose of the session really is to, I suppose, look in detail at the role of planning committee, and in particular, obviously, the focus on decision making. Appreciate this isn't the first such training that you've had, but we felt that by inviting the Planning Advisory Service to come along and lead the session today, we've got some people who are experienced in giving this kind of training session to members, but also benefit from seeing how committees operate across the country. So hopefully giving that kind of wider context and hopefully backing up what the advice that we give you on a regular basis, but you'll have to let us know if there's anything different that you spot. So just to introduce Garreth and Rachel, who are sat to my right. So they're from the Planning Advisory Service, and somebody who's joining us online is Councillor Bill Stevens, who's from Plymouth Council and Chair of Planning Committee. Again, we felt that would be quite a useful addition, hopefully, in terms of adding to that member perspective on these things. So just to briefly go over the training topic, as I say, the main theme really is how we can best make decisions as a planning committee. And clearly that involves us as officers giving you advice, yourselves as decision makers listening to that advice, listening to the input from other stakeholders, members of the public included, and coming to judgments in the round yourselves as members, but making sure that the decisions that we reach as a council are defensible. And by that, obviously, we're meaning if there's any refusals of planning permission, that they're likely to succeed at appeal. So I'll pass over to Garreth and Rachel now. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much, David. That's great. And thanks ever so much for inviting us. We're really, really pleased to be here, really grateful to be here. We know it's a bit of a busy time of year for local politicians and national politicians, and it's always busy in local government, isn't it? So we will make the most of, we've got about 2 hours. So we will make the most of your time. We do have chance if needed for a little break as well. So I'll flag that up if we need a comfort break. But before we start, I'll just introduce myself and Rachel as well, and Councillor Stevens, who's online, because I think it's important, you know, who we are, because I think planning is, you know, it's one of those disciplines in local government where you can be an expert, but there's always something that trips you up and always something that new that comes in. So my background, for example, is working in more combined authority strategic planning. I live up in South Yorkshire in Barnsley, so I used to work for Sheffield City region and Greater Manchester, as well as in local government. And I know you're in an interesting part of the world here, looking towards Sheffield in South Yorkshire and towards the Midlands as well. So I knew Adrian a little bit actually before we did this from working with him when I was based up there. Do you want to introduce yourself, Rachel?
Yeah, thank you, Gareth. So my name's Rachel Murtagh. I come from Darlington because the PAS team are scattered throughout the whole of England, and we cover pretty much most areas and regions. I've got an environmental background. So immediately, I have worked in local government, but immediately prior to joining PAS this January, I was managing a nature partnership, and I supported the local government in the Tees Valley. So it's 5 planning authorities, particularly around issues like the NPPF and biodiversity net gain coming into force. And the chair of our nature partnership is also a past president of the Royal Town Planning Institute, the RTPI. So I came on board with PAS in January, and specifically to look at a new thing that's being introduced through the Environment Act called protected site strategies. So it is linked to local nature recovery strategies and other mechanisms in the Environment Act and biodiversity net gain, but it's specifically around protected sites. And when I talk about protected sites in the legislation, It means triple SIs, of which I know you have some in your district, but also the big sites like special areas of conservation and special protection areas. So it's looking at rolling out that mechanism specifically around those protected sites, but that will link in and plug into local nature recovery strategies. That's me. Lovely to be here.
Thank you. And we'd like to call on Rachel's environmental planning expertise as well as we go through the presentation. But calling in from Plymouth, do you want to introduce yourself as well, Bill?
Thanks ever so much, Gareth. Morning, everybody. It's great to be with you. I'm Councillor Bill Stevens. I'm now just entering my 21st year as a member of our planning committee, so I'm still struggling to realise what I've done to deserve that. I must have annoyed my group leader at some stage, but it's a really interesting time. When isn't planning interesting, let's face it? And I've served for 12 years on and off as our chair, and also shadow chair when we've had periods of opposition. So I've seen it, I think, from all political angles, and I really enjoy these sessions, and I'm looking forward to a really good discussion as the morning goes on.
Cheers, Bill. Yeah, I just wanted to do that because I want to explain where we're coming from as well. So if the slides come up, can they come up on screen? There we go. I just wanted to explain a little bit about what PAS is as well, and where we're coming from when we deliver these type of training. So we are funded by government through DLUC and through DEFRA as well for different projects, but we are part of the local government association. So we do like to say we're part of the local government family. So most of us have worked in local government in planning authorities. We're a small team. We have some generalist planners and some specialists like Rachel. But the really good thing that I hope we can bring is that experience of working with over 300 odd different local authorities from across the country, because we get that sense of where things are working well and what the best practice is. And of course, we can also draw on a network of peers as well, like Bill from Plymouth and other members, as well as officers who can share their expertise. So that's our mission, if you like, is set out in that little phrase there. And just to go over what David said, so the objectives for this session are pretty clear. It is about your role on planning committee and thinking through how decisions are made and how we can improve the way that we make decisions as well. And as David alluded to, actually how we avoid making what might be poor decisions and therefore costly mistakes for a local authority. I must admit, I do think, as I said earlier, planning, we're going to talk about the essentials of planning and, you know, the really key issues and really key facts that we need to understand. But it's a very interesting area because, of course, how you apply the essentials in North East Derbyshire will be very different to the way Councillor Stevens applies them in Plymouth, to the way my planning team up in Barnsley applies them. Each place and area has its own essential kind of characteristics and unique aspects. So we're always learning when we do this. And although we can go through the essentials, I really want to hear from you what that means for you in your local area as well. The key thing is for me as well, is about when you're making a planning decision, you need to be able to justify that decision for yourself, to know that you've come to the best decision for your area and your community. But of course, to the applicant who's paying money for this service, to the residents who vote for us in local government, and to the planning inspectorate to whom applicants can appeal if they feel that we're making bad decisions. So it's about how we can justify our decisions as well. And let's be honest, in the round, make sure that the local authority is seen to making good decisions in the interest of its area. And I often say in planning, it's not just coming to the best decision, it's being seen to go through the process to deliver the best decision as well. I've had the pleasure of watching you guys on the YouTube channel and watching planning committees as well. And, you know, it is often in local government the most watched part of what we do in local council. And it's really important that it's seen to work well as work well and in the interests of the area. Are you going to use that phrase? I'll get it in early, but we'll use it again and again. we do say that planning committee is the shop window of the local authority, and it's how we sell ourselves and communicate ourselves to the rest of the community and stakeholders as well. And just to move on, as I say, it's a discussion. We'd like to. I think we are being recorded. So we have to use a microphone so we record it properly, but really keen to get questions as we go through as well, so that, we can start to explore some of the issues and what they mean for North East Derbyshire. We got 40 odd slides, which sounds like a lot, but really they're just prompts for us to talk about issues and prompts for us to talk about examples of where things can work well and where there are risks as well in what we do. So there are going to be 4 key sections that we go through. We're going to talk about the general context for decision making. We're going to talk about then how decisions are made in a practical way. And then Bill's going to talk a little bit about the councillor's role and how decisions are made to be defensible, justifiable, and the consequences of not making defensible decisions, if you like. Does that sound a good way to spend a Monday morning, do we think? Are we happy with that? I mean, just out of interest, I know that we've got a range of different experience in the room. Are there anybody in here that's new to planning committee or relatively new to planning committee? At least 1, 2, 3, 4. Fantastic. And of course, we'll have people in the room as well that are pretty well experienced and maybe been sitting on planning committee for a while now. Do you mind me asking how long have you been on committee then, guys? 2017. That's a good chunk of time, isn't it? Yeah. So 1 year. You can learn a lot in 1 year though, can't you? Yeah. So hopefully this is a refresher, but equally you'll have experience to share as well. So we're keen to hear that from you as well. Okay. Okay, so just to talk a little bit about what decision making is then, as we move to think about the context of what we're doing on local planning committees. I think the key thing is, and this is underwritten in planning legislation and policy framework as well. It's about creating a positive and proactive process and planning positively, making decisions positively for your area, and that's written in the National Planning Policy Framework. So we have to accept that. But also, if we think about it as well, it is about delivering positive outcomes for your communities and your area. So it's not just about stopping bad developments, as that slide says. It's about delivering the ambitions for your area as set out in your local plan and for that wider community. And it's about trying to be positive and proactive to encourage delivery and investment as well. So for me, I think planning is, we wouldn't be in the career if we didn't want to be. It's the best profession in local government because we have that ability to really change places for the better, and for local elected members as well, that ability to make decisions about our places. But of course, the other thing as well is that planning creates headlines. And I'm sure you find that in your local media and increasingly on social media as well. The decisions you make will be controversial. That's because they affect people's lives directly. We often say, don't we, when we're in, well, I do anyway, just to keep things in perspective, what's the worst that can happen? No one's going to die from things I do in my job. But actually, that's true. Not yet, anyway. That is true, honest. But, the decisions you make have a very, very real impact on people. That's either the applicant or the people neighbouring the application and the scheme and the wider community. You know that. I've watched some of your planning committee meetings, and that, just for example, that discussion that you had with a gypsy family about creating a new site for 5 mobile homes on the edge of a village, and it becomes very personal and very, very real very quickly, doesn't it, really? And we've got to work our way through that process and try and deliver a rational, defensible decision in the midst of what will be quite a lot of emotion from some aspects as well. And of course, the press always likes to have that kind of, that dead hand of bureaucracy stopping great things happen kind of angle, all that type of thing. The local press is really good at it. And of course, we're in a general election as well, which increases the stakes even more. I'm not trying to be party political here, but every political party that seems to be interviewed at the moment talks about planning one way or the other. You know, that general election period has just really ramped it up, particularly around housing and the housing shortage and the need to build more houses. And, you know, some national politicians blame local planning authorities for being the blocker word, for stopping things happening. I think that's a bit simplistic, and you'll know more than me that it's a lot more complicated than in the real world. But we are having a light shone on us at the moment. I was listening to the news just this morning coming down. Apparently, you know, the Labour spokesperson on crime and justice says the problems we don't have enough prison places is because local authorities have been stopping prisons being built. So the Labour proposal, I understand, is to move prison building out of the local planning regime into nationally significant infrastructure regime as well. So straight away, planning comes up in all kinds of ways and debates that we might not necessarily think about. So sometimes, though, we do step into that trap of maybe making decisions that enables people to be critical of planning, and that's what we want to avoid, because it's not an easy job, and we want to be seen to be doing the best that we can. And I think this, without sounding too pompous and too self-important, I think we've got to admit that planning isn't easy. It's, as we said, we're making contentious decisions. The decisions that you make will be life-changing for some people, and you're doing it in the public eye. Say, you know, but 300 or 400 people watch your planning committees according to YouTube. So, you know, we're not threatening Big Brother or Britain's Got Talent, but that's still a significant amount of people who are going to be well informed and really keen to see what you're doing. And to do that, of course, you do need to work and you need to prepare, and it takes time and effort. And that's really important, and something that Councillor Stevens will talk about, that actually preparing for meetings and doing the homework is so important when we're on planning committee. But on the other hand as well, I would argue, and I hope that you'd agree, that planning brings its rewards, that it is about making real decisions that have an impact on your place, that is about delivering new homes and jobs and making your part of the world a better part of the world for your communities. And that's what you guys get into politics for. And of course, you're not on your own. And this is something we want to explore as well, is that you're part of a team. You've got officers that you can draw on. You're part of that kind of collective, and you can ask their advice as well. And the experience that you bring is really valuable. You're bringing that member perspective, that insight to the local communities that officers can't deliver. So together, you're in a better position for making a better decision. Just to talk a little bit then about the context for decision making in terms of development, what we mean by development. So I'm going to read this out because this is quite important. But planning is obviously focused around giving permission for development, and development is very clearly defined in the Planning Acts. So development is defined in statute as the carrying out of building, engineering, mining, or other operations in, on, over, or under land, or the use of any buildings or other land. So, you know, it's a pretty broad definition, isn't it? So it could include everything. Clearly, if that wasn't managed in some way, the whole system would grind to a halt because there'd be far too many applications. So we have permitted development from the General Permitted Development Order. Are people familiar with the General Permitted Development Order? Yeah, so not everything needs planning permission, particularly development within a building, unless it's a retail, creating more retail floor space, doesn't need planning permission. Some agricultural buildings don't, obviously, and a lot of householder applications don't need planning permission. And increasingly as well, through what's called the use class order, we've seen changes in use being taken outside of the planning permission as well. So the use class order defines every single use that we have in terms of planning, and changing within each subclass or class of that use class order doesn't normally require planning permission. So, for example, are people familiar with use class E? Has that come up? It's one of my favourites. Basically, use class E is something that the current government introduced a couple of years ago that classifies a lot of things that happen in our town centre and high streets as one use class order. So, for example, if you've got a shop, you can turn it into a coffee shop or a gym, or even a medical centre, I think, without actually requiring planning permission. And the aim was to create that type of flexibility so that businesses could adapt to changing consumer needs. And I must admit that was quite contentious when it came in, but I would suggest it could be seen as quite a positive change, because if you think of some of the high street changes that we've seen in our town and village centres, you can have a bookshop that also has a yoga class that might have a coffee bar in as well, and these things can happen all in one place now without the need for planning permission to change it. So it's quite dynamic. Of course, what the government also did, which was maybe not quite as well received by certainly local authorities and many businesses, they've introduced permitted development for some changes of use from things like office to residential. So now you have deemed permission to be able to change your office into residential. You do need to talk to your authority and get prior consent, but in principle, we can't manage that change unless we bring in other legal measures like Article 4 directions and things like that. Is this all sounding quite familiar? Yeah, good. I'm glad to hear it. I mean, I say I don't want to get bogged down in the legal too much, but it's really interesting how planning is quite a fluid thing, and different governments come in and change some of the little things around the edges. That means your job changes, Adrian's job changes, and we have to try and make the best of that and make it work as best we can for our areas. But overall, most decisions are made by local councils. As it says there, 99% of planning is controlled by local councils. Some things are different, like nationally significant infrastructure isn't a local authority planning decision, but local authorities still have a really important role to play in that, I would argue. We'll come on to it, but of course, any refusals are open to appeal by the applicant, and not just refusals as well. Any conditions that you elect to put on an approval can be appealed. And equally, if we don't make decisions quickly enough, applicants can appeal for non-determination as well. So there is that, to call it a sword of Damocles sounds a bit dramatic, but there is that over and above us that we really need to keep in the back of our mind all the time. And of course, judicial review and local government ombudsman, you'll be aware of that. Anyone can if you like, make a case for judicial review and request that one of your decisions can go. Not anyone, but any interested party. And the term interested party is very widely defined. So we have to be seen to be doing things in a legally and defended way. So in terms of what decisions are made by a committee, then, as it says on there, it's up to you. Your scheme of delegation kind of sets how many planning decisions come to committee and how many are delegated to authorities. And what we argue is that committees should only really make decisions where it needs that kind of public scrutiny, where it is sensitive or it is significant enough so that it can be seen to be giving the kind of time, effort and consideration to give people confidence about the decision that's made there. Of course, it's always a balancing act. Agenda, I don't know, you can have very long agendas if you're on a planning committee because you have a lot of schemes coming for your consideration. I think most local authorities have a delegation rate of over 90%. That sounds a hell of a lot. And it is in terms of numbers, but also obviously it's the more straightforward things go to officers to decide in a delegated way. Now, I think in you're well over 90%. So you've seems to me you've got quite an effectively working scheme of delegation. It's quite. I had a quick read of it. I don't know if many people use it, but my reading of it is that kind of obviously it's down to the officers to identify with the chair sensitive schemes that should be brought to committee, but there's a calling procedure as well where local councillors can ask for a committee to consider applications if it is of particular importance. Do we think that's working quite well? How does the balance feel from your perspective? It seems, I mean, yeah, I mean, in terms of numerical, I think you've got like 97, 98% of all decisions are delegated to author. The last figure I saw anyway was around the 90. So you are pretty, you know, pretty above average on that, and you seem to have a manageable workload. But the other thing as well, I suppose, like moving on, is that what happens then when you need to start to think about these decisions. So the first point we need to really understand about the context is that it's policy led in England, and we, you know, I think we're all used to that term now. There's a basic framework for planning policy called the National Planning Policy Framework, the NPPF, and that sets out the kind of rules of engagement, and we can't ignore that. It's as simple as that, really. But so you've got officers who can talk to you about that and explain that with you, so you don't have to read it, but it's really important that you as members understand its position and understand its role in the job that you've got to do. And I know in some of your reports, officers will refer to certain paragraphs and sections of the NPPF to justify their recommendation. So you've got to understand just the role of that. There are also some national policy statements as well, but the previous government slimmed those down a lot more. So the vast majority of our guidance is in the NPPF, and some specialist guidance on things like gypsy and travellers. And for the development case officers, the development management case officers, we have planning practice guidance as well that really helps us understand how to apply the National Planning Policy Framework. So that's what happens at a national level, and then obviously at a local level, the policy framework for your decisions is set by the development plan or local plan. And increasingly important as well are neighbourhood plans and neighbourhood policies, and obviously you've got all of those. So we'll go through those and go through a few key points on each. Okay. But the basic principle, and this is the key thing that we have to remind ourselves all the time, and perhaps sometimes you have to remind your constituents and your community, is that when we're making defensible decisions, it is the law that we start with the plan. So the 2004 Planning Compulsory Purchase Act says, you know, we start with the plan, and that's a quote from it. When you're making a decision, you must have regard to the provisions of the development plan so far as it's material to the application and to any other material considerations. And I've rather crudely highlighted that word material because it's one we're going to come back to time and time again, because that's, you know, it's a little word that means a lot in planning, isn't it? So we really will need to explore that. And I think the other thing as well that we sometimes forget when we're working, you know, maybe when we're considering applications and working in this environment, is that we've got to look at the plan in its entirety, not just one section of it. We've got to think what policies in the plan apply to the decision that we're making. And that's what you have officers to do. And it's their job to look at which policies are relevant and look at those policies in the round so that we can weigh them up and come to a rational decision. So just really quickly then, obviously, this is your development plan. North East Derbyshire local plan adopted back in 2021. So it is up to date. You're in a better position than some local authorities who don't currently have an up-to-date local plan. The basic guidance and principle is that once it gets over 5 years old, it starts getting out of date. So you've got to review it. And I know that's something that your officers has always started to consider, although it doesn't go out of date until towards the end of next year. There has been a lot of changes in national legislation, and so some aspects of the plan will not be as up to date as they need to be. But overall, I think the decision's been taken that review won't start until we get a little bit more certainty around any changes to the local plan process that the government have been proposing in recent legislation. So you have an up-to-date local plan, and that's really positive, but it's also about, you know, national legislation and changes that have been made that will bring that more up to that will kind of outdate that update that local plan in your thinking. So because you're in a county area, the other part of your development plan is obviously the waste and minerals local plans that are managed by Derbyshire County Council, not necessarily something that we'll talk about a lot, because that's a county council planning responsibility. And I guess will some people on planning committee also be on county council as well? Have we got any? At least one. So I don't know if that's something you've come across at county level yet. No, it's quite niche, isn't it? Waste and minerals. We don't see applications for that very frequently. But as well as local plans, then you do have neighbourhood plans. So neighbourhood plans were brought in relatively recently by the 2011 Localism Act. Like, you know, can you remember David Cameron and the kind of localism agenda, which seems a long time ago now? But that was, you know, that was quite a significant change in planning. Kind of local neighbourhood plans grew out of things like community design statements and the need for local communities to feel that they were better engaged in the plan. You've got 6. I know places like Bassetlaw, just up the road, have got 20 odd neighbourhood plans. You know, it's really taken off in some parts of the world, particularly in the southeast as well. And of course, as a planning committee, you need to be aware of those because they do help inform the framework for your decisions. Just out of interest, is anyone in the room in a ward that has a neighbourhood plan? Yeah, were you involved in its development? You're aware of it? Yeah. How does it? How do? It always gets trumped by the local plan. It does, yeah. Mm.
If you've actually gone through trouble, that a more extensive consultation process you do with the local plan, the needs of residents directly at that level should be really taken into account and given more weight.
And this is a really good example, and I can understand you saying that. And I guess what I have to say in response, I respect exactly what you're saying, but of course, as you know, it's quite a hierarchical approach, and local plans need to be in alignment with a national policy framework, and neighbourhood plans need to be in alignment with the local plan, and that kind of, shall we call it, a creative dynamic, creative tension between the different tiers can lead to quite a lot of in-depth debate, I imagine, can't it? It's sorry, do people need to put their do people need to put their microphone on if they're speaking? I'm just aware we might not be picking up your wisdom here. So
Oh, it's not wisdom. It's not creative tension, it's a hierarchy.
yeah.
And that's very frustrating. And again, I understand everything about, you know, national directives and planning, the need for infrastructure. But if you've got this legislation for very local decisions at the local level, deciding where you want your parks to be, I think, I'm just saying it should be given more weight than it is.
And I agree. I think neighbourhood plans can really fill in the gap as well, where local plans don't have the detail. And I've mainly worked in urban areas, so I'll be honest, I haven't worked with a lot of neighbourhood plans. But from what I read, they're very good mechanisms for, if you like, developing a much more informed debate on planning as well. In a community that's been involved in a neighbourhood plan is a lot more switched on to planning, full stop, and that's a really important thing as well. So as well as the kind of as well as the way that the neighbourhood plan delivers or doesn't on the policies, it's that building up of capacity that's so important in a local community. So, you know, they are contentious, but overall can bring a lot to local debate. Another key point that we really need to cover, and this is, you know, again, this is part of that kind of legislative framework and hierarchy, is this presumption in favour of development, sustainable development. So at the heart of the NPPF is this principle of sustainable development. And sustainable development is quite, Rachel and I were talking about it earlier this morning, it's one of those terms that's been around a long time now. You know, it comes, the definition here, meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs, actually comes from a report called the Brundtland Report back in 1987, produced by the United Nations. The reason I'm saying that is that it has actually changed the way we think about planning, because it is very much about creating the best balance and coming to the best balance between environmental considerations, social considerations, and economic considerations as well. Easy to say, but this is what you're doing when you're trying to come to a good decision on any planning application, is deliver sustainable development that maximises each of these different elements of sustainability. And of course, that's sometimes those elements are very much in conflict with each other, and that's why we have to talk about the planning balance and how we weigh up those different elements, which is something that we'll come on to. But it's quite interesting. You can see in that diagram there that, you know, kind of just economic consideration on its own isn't sustainable. You know, just looking at the economic impacts of a development and the social impacts might help to deliver a more equitable development, but we really need to think about the environmental impacts to deliver true sustainable development. And it's kind of, it looks a bit theoretical and a little bit kind of, if you like, high level hairy-fairy there, but it really does matter when you come to make a decision on schemes that come in front of you. But what that presumption in favour of sustainable development means is that we have to be positive when we approach planning applications. So sustainable development needs to be pursued in a positive way because it's at the heart of the MPPF, and it is that presumption in favour of sustainable development. And what that actually means is, if a proposal that comes to you accords to an up-to-date development plan, then it should be approved without delay. Where there are no relevant development plan policies, or the policies are out of date, or kind of otherwise kind of, if you like, compromised, then we can grant permission unless there's a clear reason in the MPPF for not doing so, or the adverse impacts of doing so outweighs those benefits. And it's that, if you like, the weight, when we think about this theoretically, the weight is towards granting permission, and the weight of legislation and guidance is towards kind of granting permission for any scheme that accords with the development plan. But you have to take that judgment of whether other material factors change the way, counter that, and so you come to a different decision. So, I mean, one question we do get asked is, can we ignore the development plan? Well, no, because that's now illegal. We've agreed, haven't we, under Section 38 of the planning legislation. The other thing we say is, but why would you? Because it's your plan, and having a plan is so important when we're trying to make consistent decisions and deal with things as they come before us. So you can't ignore your plan, but as it says there, you can justify taking a decision which seems to conflict with the plan, so long as it's based on the merits of the case, in light of, again, I'm highlighting it, all the material considerations that you think apply to that case, or that do apply to that case. And I know you've had decisions that may be contrary to your development plan, and you've had to think through whether to approve a development that doesn't absolutely align. I think, was it Clay Cross, some of the kind of development around Clay Cross? So there was a case that you considered recently where you were looking at allowing more residential development there, decreasing some of the employment land, and you approved that because you could see that there were material considerations that would be able to justify that decision. Also, what you could not also bear in mind as well is you can take a decision which conflicts with the plan if the policy is out of date compared with national policy, if the situation on the ground has changed, a little bit like you were discussing with Clay Cross, but you need to be sure that you've got proper evidence to prove that the situation's changed. And that's the thing, you can't just assume it has, you've got to be able to prove that the situation's changed on the ground, or if any unforeseen opportunity arises. I think I remember doing some work, I think was it Bolsover, when Elon Musk was looking at locating a new battery factory somewhere in England, and there were sites that were being considered not far from this part of the world. That's the kind of opportunity that you might say, we couldn't really foresee that when we had a local plan, but if we can accommodate it, the economic impact is so great, that's great. It might have been Bassetlaw or Bolsover, I can't remember which. It was one of those. It ended up going to Berlin anyway. We didn't get it in the Midlands. But so just to finish on this point then, why we need local plans and local policy and planning. Without trying to hammer this home too much, let's just take a step back and think about it really. Your local plan is about bringing certainty to the future for your residents, and so they can see what is envisaged or what you as a local authority envisage for the future of your communities. Importantly, it also helps bring confidence to developers and new investors, helping investment decisions. Do have to make difficult decisions, and your plan can help you do that and steer the way. And importantly, can make things happen. It makes things happen that you want to happen, but it also helps you to respond to things that you don't necessarily know are going to come up so that they happen in the best way for your area. Excuse me. So that's the first section really about the context. Are there any questions or anything that doesn't sound right on that? Are we happy with the way that that's been summarized? You sure? Yeah. So moving on then to think about how we make decisions. This is where that phrase material consideration comes in. Can you remember that quote that we had on the slide earlier? Having regard to the provisions of the development plan so far as material to the application and to any other material considerations. So just delving in a little bit more then to what we mean by material considerations. When we say material in planning, all we mean is, significant or most important. That's what it's just a planning phrase. What we need to do when we use that term material is to say, well, what is material? What is significant? And also how much weight should we attach to it? Because some of these material considerations are directly in opposition to each other. Obviously, economic job growth and environmental protection can be completely in contrast. So how do we weigh competing issues against each other? This is where I'm going to attempt a quiz. This is a type of quiz that you can only have in planning circles. It's not a pub quiz, it's a planner's quiz this. So there's a list of issues here. Which of these do we think are material considerations? So loss of light or overshadowing, material or not material? Correct, I think you're right, yeah. Boundary disputes or covenants? Anybody think that's material? No. The strength or volume of opposition? Sorry? Not material. Anyone disagree? Well, I'm going to show the answers and we will see. Previous decisions or appeals? We think that's material. What about personal circumstances? No. This came up, didn't it, with that case with the Gypsy family, daughter who was unwell. It's hard to say that sometimes, but we can't consider such personal circumstances, or in very, very rare situations can we make that material or relevant. Parking, that's a favourite one, isn't it? I'm sure your residents remind you of that regularly. Overlooking, loss of privacy. We're getting some good answers down here. Anyone else? Yep, you're dead right. Yeah. What about loss of a private view? Not supposed to be. Yeah, that's right. Public views, and the view of St Paul's across London, that's definitely material, but someone's view of an open green field, not material. Traffic and volumes of traffic, definitely. Layout and density, yeah, getting nods over there too. What about damage to property and party wall kind of act matters? Correct, not material. And disabled access? just go down and see. I think you got them all right. So you are right. It's really kind of some of those examples are easier than others. You know, things like damage to a party wall or property or party wall that matters. They're not material, but they are relevant. So, you know, they can be, they shouldn't affect your decision, but you can ask the officers to put an informative in the planning decision to tell the developer or remind the developer that there are other issues that they need to be aware about, just to reassure yourselves that these issues are being considered as well. I think that point around the strength or volume of opposition, we can say in this room that's not material. How does that feel when you're in a public meeting or when you're doing a surgery or when you've got some members of the public sat in the public gallery? It's not quite as black and white, but of course the line there is, and quite clearly, it's not the volume, it's not the number of comments, it's the issues they're raising that are material. If they're raising material issues, they are very relevant kind of comments that you need to bear in mind. But this isn't, you know, it's not the Eurovision Song Contest. We're not just weighing the votes one way or another. We're coming to a decision that can be defended in a quasi-legal process. And just for example, that's a kind of general list of material considerations. Still a lot of things to think about, I think, and still a lot of things that can, you know, take up a lot of time and a lot of effort to try and assess and understand. But, you know, not everything. Is there anything on there that's particularly relevant locally that comes up again and again? Do you think? Oh, really? Oh, sorry. Do you want to put a? I must admit, I'm interested in.
Yeah, flood risk, definitely. We have now. I mean, things have changed rapidly, but unfortunately, some of the flooding issues have been due to development as well. Yes. Yes.
Sorry, I was just saying, and it's that your communities are very aware of that. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, and there's a topology issue with the soil and everything. You're on clay, and you know, Gronfield Pond is a basin. So yeah, I don't think there doesn't seem to be a sufficiently proper mechanism to deal with some of these issues. And again, as you've said, a lot of it is due to previous development because you develop things and you haven't got enough drainage or drains and things. Some of the drains are, I think, in Renishaw, they're 100 years old, aren't they? What's it called? Culverts. Culverts, yeah. So you've got 150-year-old infrastructure which isn't sufficient for the building that you're going to put on it. But where are you going to get £20 million to go and replace all your drains? So I think it is a significant issue.
And we've actually got attenuation funds on new development that aren't working. And nobody seems to want to know. And at the moment, the homeowner is being asked to sort out the costs because the developers don't want to know anymore. Everybody seems to have, you know, walked away from it.
We haven't got. Sorry, go on. I guess, I mean, I'm looking at it again, it's a really good example because it's a very material, tangible issue. And it's one that the public need to have confidence in has been thought about. I'm guessing that obviously in reports, Adrian, there'll be kind of report from from the local authority and maybe from the Environment Agency on their comments on things like housing developments?
Yeah, we'll get comments from the Environment Agency where they're relevant, and then more locally, the lead local flood authority who give us advice on that. And we try and advise members in terms of the various flood zones, sequential test, exception test, etc. But it is very complicated, and we are, as officers, we're not flood experts. We are reliant on the advice that we get.
And that's the other thing, is it's about our relationship, as Adrian said, with the lead local flood authority, but also with the Environment Agency, and how much evidence does the Environment Agency have about some of the, intricacies of your local area. So I think certainly kind of where we've worked with the Environment Agency in the past, they can, like any statutory consultee, they can struggle to kind of comment, and they can struggle to get engaged in the detail that you might want them to. But that is starting, as I understand it, that's starting to improve. And certainly the issue is that some of the applications that we're dealing with now, like you were saying, have attenuation ponds and have a lot more kind of like measures to control flooding within their site. But we are dealing with a history of issues from previous developments as well, as you say, aren't we?
Environments are funny things, aren't they? Because you introduce a new, I'm not an engineer, I'm not a scientist, but you introduce a new factor into an environment, and the old black swan, it has a multiplying effect. So you may well have all these people looking at historic information, but as I said, I don't know what the effect will be of having 100-year-old infrastructure of drains in Renishaw which are inadequate and cracking. The 20 million solution, who's going to pay for that? Nobody. But if you overbuild on that, it may well be that they're not zone flooding, but common sense says that you start to affect an environment and load it with variables, then the system itself goes over, and then people have problems.
Just a couple of other things, Gareth, if I may. In terms of drainage in North East Derbyshire, there's a lot of combined systems. So there's an issue about surface water runoff and foul drainage becoming mixed up in areas of high rainfall. And the advice we're looking for there, it comes from the statutory water company, so Yorkshire Water, Severn Trent. So again, we're reliant on the information that we get from those bodies, which is often questioned by members because of their local knowledge. But again, as officers, our advice to members is reliant on that information that we get back. But of course, the capacity of those, as councillors have mentioned, is on a local level often different to what the water companies themselves are providing us with the information on.
We have a dichotomy. The planning system is geared to deliver development, and at the moment, and for the last several years, it's been to deliver housing. And it's not infrastructure led. There are certain parts of the country that have attacked infrastructure first. For example, around Doncaster or Wath-on-Dearn and places like that. The roads were built before the development. Here we've got an old infrastructure, and the Derby Road is a classic example, where we're now looking at long-term solutions to a problem that's been created by adding development to an old infrastructure, and the sewers are the same. And so in the application process, unfortunately, the developer has to request the sewer upgrades. It isn't done first. And that's a problem that this nation has to sort of decide how it wants to function. The infrastructure comes last. The development comes too quickly, in my humble opinion.
Just again on that, Gareth, if I may, the issues around the local plan and the importance that it plays in respect of this is not to be underplayed either, because in the work that Helen and her team do, we're clearly getting that information, infrastructure support from the water companies and the Environment Agency, and that should have been fed into the local plan preparation. So in advising members on the predominance of the local plan, that information should be relatively recently provided, so it should be evidenced and based on. And then the problem we have is, as you've said earlier on, if you're going to go against the local plan for reasons of flooding, for example, what evidence is that the planning committee can rely on? And if the statutory consultees are providing an answer, it's very difficult then to justify that if it is challenged on appeal, because the inspector will place great weight on the comments of the statutory undertakers.
Really interesting, isn't it? And I think, as you said, this is a national issue. It doesn't help you to say you're not on your own. You're not the only local authority facing this. That these issues are cropping up in other areas. As you say, having a local plan, you are in a better position because that local plan gives you kind of obviously some sense of that early assessment and sense of where there are issues and limiting capacity, but also you can ask for planning obligations and you can ask for funding to kind of deal with some of these issues caused by new development, because you've got a local plan in place that enables you to do that and gives you more weight in that as well. But as you say, sometimes we're adding new development to an existing system and it's really hard to model or anticipate what the outcomes will be. So we've got to rely on the best evidence that we can, as Adrian said.
Because you're relying on historical information, the same the local plan is derived from, you know, the census and all the things, and it awards points to existing infrastructure, but you're not anticipating future infrastructure. So again, it's a question, and this is why I'm probably in our own area, I'm probably in favour of having a new town. Because at least with a new town, you actually, and it's not just about doctor surgeries and schools, it's about drains and it's about roads. It's about putting that infrastructure in there first, which, but that's a national, he said, it's not the current system.
The good thing is, and all right, we didn't mention at the outset, did we? We've got a follow-up session in July, and we're going to do a further training session that is going to be a little bit of role playing and a case study, and that case study is around a new housing development, a controversial housing development. So it's exactly those kind of issues that we want to explore and maybe unpick a little bit more. Can't do it right now because we're rushing through a little bit, but it would be really interesting to see how you approach that when you consider that the case study example that we want to present in July.
One final point, it's just a bugbear of mine. It's about the sort of transport issue. There's a tendency, because the developers all want to build on the greenfield land because it's easier and more profitable. If you look at the work that's been done, I think LSE did quite a good bit of work. Where you should build houses is no more than about 500 yards, a 5-minute walk from a main transport hub, such as a railway station or a mainline bus route, not one that's only does 2 buses a day, but a mainline one. That involves questions like densification, for example. But the easier solution, and this is that you build, again, it goes back to not the infrastructure first, is you're building on the outskirts of towns. So that means more cars if people have cars. You're not building where you can make the infrastructure like transport, public transport, work.
And what we often say is, planning is the art of the possible, and how do we make what is an imperfect system work best for our areas? It's really interesting. You know the issues, and this is, again, we can't talk, we're not going to train you on that because you know what the issues are. What we have to do is explain how the system works, and it's how you make it work best for your area. So it's maybe something to explore a little bit more in July. I am aware a little bit of time, but I don't want to stop the kind of discussion because it's really interesting. We've got Bill on the line as well, and I want to leave plenty of time for him to talk about some of these issues, because he's kind of got direct experience of how he, as a councillor, will manage those kind of obvious conflicts. So I'm building you up here, Bill. I hope that's okay, that you're going to be able to provide us some words of wisdom on that.
I can feel the pressure, Gareth. I can feel the pressure.
Yeah. Okay. So just really quickly, a list of things that your constituents maybe logically could be quite important to people when they think about what the decision needs to be on a planning application, but because of the way we set up as planning, aren't material considerations, so aren't issues that we can rely on to make sound decisions. I think that's the best way of putting it. I think just reminding ourselves as well, this isn't just a random list of things. Material considerations are either defined in law, planning law, or have been worked through through a kind of appeal, and there's been a court decision on them. So we aren't just making this up. These have been worked through in previous cases and provide, a framework for you to make your decisions. So what we're saying is then planning involves balancing issues, and this is your role. And of course, this is where we always have this graphic of some scales. None of us have scales like this anymore. They're all digital, aren't they, really? But it makes a better picture. But it is that point that things like economic growth and climate change, things like meeting rural housing need and countryside protection, they're all material, but they are in conflict with each other. And it's our job on a planning committee to make what can sometimes be very difficult and hard choices about how much weight we attach to these different issues. But I say we've got a local plan that helps us find a way through that, and we've got local officers who are doing that job and advising you on what they feel is the best outcome by making recommendations. So I won't go too much more into that at this stage, because this is something that we want to talk about in more detail with Bill. But, that sense of weighing up and coming to a sound decision, it's easy to say, but it's really important that it's done and be seen to be done. So when you're having discussions in planning committee, it should be around these issues and how much weight you're attaching to them, and also how much evidence you've got to be able to kind of come to that decision. And that will give that sense of confidence to communities and to developers and investors. And so we tend to use these type of planning terms, but the words have real meaning behind them. I think that's what I want to say. Now, having said that, some things are outside the planning balance because they've been introduced by legislation. And I thought, because this is quite timely, I wondered if we could just think a bit about biodiversity net gain and some of the environmental aspects as well, which ties into some of our concerns. Do you want to talk a little bit about this, Rachel? Because this is your area, isn't it?
Yeah, I'll just sit here. Biodiversity net gain and planning. We've been building up, and PAS has been supporting the rollout of biodiversity net gain for a couple of years now. And we've had a specialist advisor particularly working on biodiversity net gain. And it's this year, 2024 is the year for biodiversity net gain. So the 12th of February, all planning applications submitted in England, with a couple of exceptions, will have to demonstrate how they will deliver at least 10% biodiversity net gain. And then the small sites part of the legislation came through on the 2nd of April. So it's not retrospective. It doesn't look back, and previous applications up to that point don't have to include it. It's applications going forward from those dates. And so you're probably aware of this. And this 10% net gain is it does feed into the MPPF, did set this up initially, about this mitigation hierarchy. So when you're going to develop on a site, there will potentially be some loss of biodiversity depending on your site. So it's looking at this mitigation hierarchy. So how can we avoid that loss to begin with? If we can't avoid that loss, how can we mitigate, or how can we compensate? So that's the hierarchy that you move through. It doesn't change existing legal protections around important habitats and species that are covered in other parts of environmental legislation. So this is a new and an additional thing that's coming through. And the way to do that is through on-site and off-site, and through the National Credit Scheme as well. So it is quite a complex area. It's new in planning, and I'd like to say that there's some fabulous resources on the PAS website to look at and sort of dive into further. And I'm sure your officers are doing that already. And I'd imagine you're not having any applications that are coming through yet that have got these biodiversity net gain plans, but you will do in the future. So you've still got a bit of preparation time, fortunately. So just moving to the second slide. But yeah, I mean, you're doing pretty well in your area, North East Derbyshire. So quite a few things tumbled out of the Environment Act, including this strengthened duty under the NERC duty. And this is part of this biodiversity report that you published at the beginning of this year, and it's already flagged up how, as an authority, you're supporting biodiversity net gain, which is fantastic. So it's new. There's complexities to it, and we're all learning across the whole country. But luckily, we can sort of plug into national resources like that PAS can offer. So it's exciting times. And hopefully it'll be really interesting when they start coming through your planning committee to see how it evolves. Probably all I need to say.
Good question, gentleman there, Jim.
Yeah, I've got a question. I have great concerns with this particular plan because I have experience of a developer who basically cut down the hedgerows. He bought the land today, he cut the hedgerow down tomorrow, then he put the planning application in. So the biodiversity net gain benchmark was lost.
Yeah.
He allowed a pond to dry up. There may have been nothing in there, no greater question news, I don't know. But the reality is that he treated it with total contempt.
Yeah.
Another issue I have is that a lot of these developers employ environmental or ecological people who look at it. They work from a front room somewhere. They're a small band. They're just a one-man band. They don't have the experience. They don't have the knowledge. And quite frankly, at the moment, they're playing games. And I've got two situations like that.
Yeah, it's tragic, isn't it, really? And what the introduction of such measures like this have flagged up are the challenges, particularly around expertise and ecological expertise, as you said. So I don't know if you've got an ecologist within your district. There certainly will be at the county level, which is great. Some local authorities don't even have an ecologist working for them. So there is a bit of a strain in the system, and yes, absolutely. Unfortunately, some people have sort of abused the system. As it evolves and grows, ultimately, hopefully, there will be a national net gain and even a local net gain because of this. It has meant some early losses. You're absolutely right. There are examples, not just here, but hopefully, this is a new tool that will ultimately improve biodiversity. Yeah.
Just very briefly, Rachel, if I can just butt in, one of the advantages of the BNG statutory provision is it does take into account the so-called degradation of sites. So if the scenario that you've outlined happens now, going forwards, it is caught by the new regulations. Previously, it wasn't. So there is an advantage of the BNG statutory provision now that wasn't in the legislation previously, where degradation could take place just before you submit your application. Well, bad luck.
That's a really good point. And I wanted to just spend a bit of time on this because it is new. And I think it's a really fantastic opportunity for planning to deliver. Delivering net gain is not something we've been able to do before unless we've had a lot of evidence locally and had a policy in the local plan. Now, as Adrian said, it's being delivered by statute, by law. So although it's a hard job and local authorities have a bigger job to do to monitor and enforce, and that's a different discussion, but actually it's a real potential to deliver real, environmental benefits for nature and therefore your community, I would add. And it's something I know it's one of those examples where the local plan, when it gets refreshed and updated, will be able to elaborate on that and develop it for local circumstances. So it's one of the areas where, the local authorities ahead of the game, including local plan policies that direct where net gain, can best be delivered for the area, what type of net gain is acceptable, and how issues like you mentioned will be better enforced, etc., etc. So really interesting area, but new and outside of the planning balance. I think that's what I want to say. It's a given almost. So there we go. But we're over halfway through now. How's it going? Are we okay? Yeah. Are there any questions on what we've covered so far? I'm going to stop talking for a little bit now, you'll be pleased to know. I'm going to hand over to Councillor Councillor Stevens, who's going to talk a little bit about the councillor's role and kind of decisions themselves and the implications of the decisions we make. Is that okay, Bill? Can I hand over to you now?
Yeah, that's fine, Gareth. Thanks, and morning again to everyone. We're used to working in the world of Teams and remote calls, so if anyone does have anything, it's probably best to chip in as and when you hear something that you want to comment on, and providing you use the mic, I'll hear you and we'll go from there. So our role can sometimes come into conflict with other roles we have, or appear to at least. So we're all going to be members of the planning committee, obviously those of us who serve on it. We're also still ward members, and we all have the issues in our wards that present themselves. Some of us may be in the cabinet or chairing committees, some of us may be leading for the opposition on various issues, and we're all going to be in a political group one way or the other. But it's the membership of the planning committee that has to take precedence when we're dealing with planning applications. There's no two ways about it. We're not there to look after the interests of our ward. We're not there to promote the policies or attack the policies that the administration may have, depending on what they are. We're not there to advance the interests of our own political group. Sometimes that's a bit hard for outsiders to follow, but it's important that we remember that. Next slide, please, Gareth, if you can. So what do? Our duty in making decisions is to the whole community itself, whether that's the city, a borough, depending on the council that we're in. We've got to avoid bias. We're not there. My screen's going a bit wild and wacky. I don't know if it's the same at your end. Other people are nodding there, so I'll do my
Everything's
best.
calm here. Yeah.
Excellent. So you'll be familiar, I hope, with the concept of predetermination, but about 10-15 years ago, the idea of predisposition was brought in under the localism legislation. And what that means is that we're not allowed to be predetermined, which is we can't make our mind up in advance which way we're going to vote. But the law does allow us a little bit of common sense in forming that view. So predetermination is the idea that I know which way I'm going to vote, wild horses aren't going to shift me from there, and my mind is made up and I'm definitely going to vote for or against this, and nothing can dissuade me. You can't do that. But what you can say is, my initial gut instinct on hearing this is, whatever it is, but you know what? I'm going to listen to all the arguments. I'm going to read all the evidence, listen to all the submissions, hear what officers say, hear what my colleagues on the planning committee say, and I'm going to make my mind up in the light of that. So I always give the example, a bit of a silly extreme example to prove a point, but you'll get where I'm coming from. If someone came with a planning application, and as a member of the planning committee, I read it that they wanted to, let's say, put a sewage farm next to an infant school. If I said I have absolutely no immediate reaction to that, you'd laugh at me. I would say, oh, I'm not sure about that. That seems, on the face of it, not a very good idea. But you know what? I'm going to listen to what everyone's got to say. And so long as you are prepared and give the impression of having your mind open that it can be persuaded, you're okay. And again, it's what does the wider community see the benefits of this as being, not just those who've bothered to get in touch. And it goes back to the concept that we're not looking at numbers, we're looking at arguments. And material planning considerations, again, we've touched on, those are the only things you can weigh up in terms of evidence. And it's not about hunches. It's not, well, I'm guessing, you know, I've got a feeling that no, what does the evidence tell us? Sometimes that evidence will be contradictory, and that's the most interesting bit of being on the planning committee, in my view, is trying to determine where all this evidence sits, who's making the more powerful case, providing its material considerations, and that's where it's most rewarding. Are we a jurist or an elected representative? Well, probably both, in my experience. We are there to give that openness, that transparency, so the really controversial applications aren't decided by officers behind closed doors. We do it in public by people who've been trusted by the voters to do the job. And so long as we get that blend and that balance right, I don't think you can go far wrong. Next slide, please. So yeah, predisposition is this acceptance that we're human beings. We will have an immediate reaction, and certainly as politicians, you know, we're used to giving our opinion on things. If I walked into our town hall and kept my view secret, I dare say my leader might have something to say about me, but we're not there to make our minds up on planning applications in advance. So long as you can get that balance right, you'll have absolutely no problem at all. It's this issue of you know, I'm going into the committee, I'm going to stick two fingers in my ears, la la la, no one's going to persuade me. That's predetermination, and you should have absolutely no part of it. Of course, if the feelings in your ward or the district as a whole are so strong, then you are quite free to not sit on that item on the planning committee. If people, you know, we've got an election now, we've just been through a set of local elections, many of us, if you feel the pressure is too strong, you can say to your residents, look, I'm more than happy to support you. I'm more than happy to be there on the demonstrations, deliver the leaflets, sign the petition, hold the placards, knock on doors, whatever. So long as you understand that I won't be able to vote as a member of the planning committee. And that's quite hard for some people to get their head around at first. But so long as you explain it to people and maybe give the choice to them to say, I'm happy to sit on the planning committee and vote on this, but you've got to let me make my own mind up. Put the option in their hands. We do suffer from a lot of misunderstanding out there by the public, and I always think it's an important job of planning committee members to educate not only the public but our own colleagues who perhaps don't have much to do with the planning system as to how it really works. So as long as you can get this important slide in your back pocket and always use it, you'll be fine. Next slide, please. So what makes a good planning committee member? What do we have to do? What are the key things to remember? Prepare and read the papers. It sounds obvious, but the number of planning committees I've been to, particularly before we all had IT and laptops readily available, when people would come in, find their seat, pour themselves a glass of water, and then open the envelope for the very first time and look with astonishment and interest. Oh, look what's come up today. That gives out all the wrong messages, and so it should. You should go in there not being an expert, but know what we're about to decide, know what we're considering, have a fairly good understanding of the issues, pro and con, that we're going to consider, and then how much weight to give the issues. That's really in our hands. Officers are there to give us advice, of course, but so long as it's only material considerations that we're weighing up, that's so important. Consider conditions before and reasons before the meeting. It might well be that the way to get something over the line, something that's important, is to put a couple of extra conditions on. Doesn't mean that you flood it with conditions, but it can make all the difference. And don't be afraid to take advice during the meeting. That's what officers are there for. They're there to help us come to decisions which are fair and reasonable, particularly with conditions that we may spring on them as the debates go on. And of course, we should discuss issues and concerns with officers before the committee. As chair, I often get copied into emails, particularly from our side, to officers to say, look, I'm reading through item number 7 and I've got to page 29 and I'm a bit unsure what the officer means by such and such. Can you let me know? Now, that's in no way committing them to voting one way or the other, but it does mean that when we get to the committee, the debate flows freely. Councillors are armed with all the information they need, and we give the impression to the public, both the voters and to developers, that councillors know what they're on about. Councillors have prepared and they are treating their application seriously. It means we come to a lot more rounded, defensible decisions, and we appear to be the professionals that we are. So I think you can only benefit from taking these on board. Next slide. So, unreasonableness. No one wants to be unreasonable, but it's one of those words, you know, what does it mean? And in a planning context, it means avoiding personal taste. I'm sure we could all discuss what we like and what we don't like, but that's not why we're on the planning committee. We're there to look at the evidence and the facts in front of us, and precedents from decision, both planning and appeal decisions in the past, are so important. We need to be consistent, and like a jury, we heard the word jurist a few slides ago, we are there to look only at material considerations. So I always think of it as a set of railway tracks in front of me, and within these boundaries of reasonableness, you can choose any decision you like. Once you, and that could be for or against potentially, it's when you go outside of the bounds of reasonableness that you're going to be in trouble. So don't be cowed by anybody into voting one way or the other. Come to your own conclusions, but always remember, is it reasonable? And so long as you're within that bounds of reasonableness, which is what the presentation is all about today, you'll be absolutely fine. You want to go on, please, Gareth? So we're not expected to be experts. That's what we employ officers for, both planning officers, but also the consultees. So whether it be on transport or heritage or green infrastructure, or we've spoken about flooding, or whatever it might be, we're there to listen to them and weigh up what they tell us. What we're not there to do is to create a little bit of evidence of our own to add into the mix. If we were talking outside this process, yes, of course, I've got views on heritage and my own taste and where in my ward we might have flooding and so on. But that's not what we're there to do on the planning committee. We're there to weigh up what the experts bring to us, and sometimes it can be contradictory. I'm sure you've had examples. We often do in our planning committee where, let's say, the economic development officers are saying we really need to develop this because of jobs and economic growth and it's so important, and the heritage officers are saying no, we can't pull down this historic building because of history and all the rest. So they're giving you very, very relevant but contradictory views, and your job as a planning committee is to weigh them up and decide on the arguments which one you should go for. And that's what makes it so interesting. We don't have to accept the recommendation of our officers. It is just that, a recommendation. But if you are going to go against it, make sure you've got detailed planning reasons as to why. It can't just be, I don't like it. And then again, a number of members of the public who think we can just say that. It's incredibly frustrating for them to hear. But we can only look at planning reasons. It might be that planning reasons do give you a chance to vote against something if that's where the evidence takes you, and that's absolutely fine. Again, as long as you're in the bounds of reasonableness. And of course, we need reports and minutes. Now, are your committees all webcast? Are they all available online? Ours are, and it gives us so much of a stronger hand when it comes to appeals, because it shows the inspector that we've not just nodded it through or refused something. Oh yeah, it's nearly lunchtime, so we'll just get rid of it. No, we've given it a full in-depth probe. We've asked all the right questions as a committee across party lines, and we've come to a detailed, proper, auditable decision. And that makes your decisions that you have to defend and appeal so much stronger. It's all about thinking down the line, not does this decision make me feel good today? Will it hold up at a later date? And that's what's got to be at the forefront of your mind, I think. Next slide. So yeah, we can come to a different conclusion from our officers, and officers won't mind that. They're not there to proselytize or to impose a view on us. Their job is to give us the benefit of their advice and allow us to come to our own conclusions. Again, every decision, yes or no, must be based on planning grounds and planning grounds alone. We need to give justifiable planning reasons, and that doesn't mean you need to know the layout of your plan inside out. So let's say if you want to vote against something because it will create car parking issues that can't be overcome, let's say, that's a valid material reason, so long as car parking applies to the application, of course. It's not your job as councillors to know that car parking appears in chapter 7, subsection B, paragraph 8, little 1 in your plan. That's what officers are paid to know. And don't be afraid to refer back to officers to say, can you tell us where does car parking, which page is that? Sorry, on the officers will tell you that and put that in as the reason, providing it's relevant. Again, maybe subject of appeal, but the appeal will not succeed or be a lot less likely to succeed so long as you've done the preparation throughout the decision-making process. It's basically giving you a firm decision that you can defend later on down the line, which surely is what we all want. Next slide, please. So reasons for refusal must be accurate. You can't go making things up. They must be related to the proposal. So you can't bring things in from outside. It must be related to the development plan, things that are considered, and obviously must only be material considerations. Don't be afraid to ask officers for advice both before and during the meeting. It shouldn't, a planning committee shouldn't be a confrontational experience where we're going into battle against the officers because we've got a view and officers have got another view and we're trying to see who wins. That's not how it should work. What we want is for your council to come up with a decision that stands up to public and legal scrutiny, and it should be a collaborative effort. Officers are there to help you, make sure you stay within the bounds of reasonableness, make sure you don't bring in any non-material considerations by accident, and to make sure that the decision is as fair and firm and robust and defensible as possible. So officers are there to support us, not to impose a view on us. And again, for some people outside of the process looking on, particularly our constituents, sometimes that's a bit hard to appreciate, particularly when officers have come to a view that the public don't agree with. But it's important we stay on track and only remember only our role and not the outside considerations. Next slide. So again, we can be challenged, and please have this at the back of your mind at all times. It's so important that we remember that the planning committee is not necessarily the end of the process. This decision, the one that you're making today, may well come up for scrutiny later on, and you may be asked to help the case officer to prepare the council submission for the appeal. So don't think it's all over. Have the issues at the forefront of your mind and be ready to back your decision, back up the vote that you've cast. And I think that's probably comes to the end of my session, Gareth, I think, but I'm more than happy again to help out and chip in as the debate and questions go on.
Yeah, thank you. But we have got a question, Bill.
So by all means.
Can we take that now? That's great.
By all means.
Well, it's not so much of a question. It's I'm Nigel Barker. I'm leader at District Council, and I've been
I've been a district council for a long while, probably too long. But I've seen over that period of time, what I'm doing is backing up your collaborative thing working, because there has been times where it's been a them and us thing. I think at this council where I don't know if Adrian back me up, but there's been that, like you reiterated there, about councillors and officers not seeing eye to eye. And I think we've got away from that, but I really want to stress that I think we've got excellent officers here that will try the best to help us to arrive at a consensus, really. But obviously we've got to work through all those rules and things like that. But I will echo what you've just said. It's about working together as a one team sort of thing. Sometimes the officers might not give the answers that you like, but they're all doing the best because of all the rules and regulations. And I think if we can keep that in back of our heads at all times, that's what we're trying to achieve, and we've got to abide by what's been said about the rules. And it might be appealed, it might not, but we can't just do because we don't want to do something. We've got to have evidence. That's basically what. And there's been times where that's not been ever so clear. That's me, Terry. Thank you.
Thanks, leader. I think that's absolutely spot on.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think this slide just underpins your point, actually. If we are going to make a decision against officer recommendations, ask yourself, what is the evidential basis for that, as we've just heard? Is it clear why permission is being refused? But also, is it clear to you? Is it clear to the person who will be reading that decision in the minutes? Is it clear to the people who's watching the committee? They understand where you've gone, how you've come to that decision, because that all helps you defend that decision if it is appealed against. And importantly as well, can you describe the harm that you've avoided by making that refusal? And really, really specifically. Equally, obviously some harms can be conditioned, or we can apply conditions, additional conditions, as Bill said, to try and mitigate harms. And we need to be confident that that conditions won't be sufficient to provide us with that reassurance. So yes, this is. Do we need to say this? Let's listen to what officers are telling you. I'm sure you do that, as we've just heard. They are there to help you make sound decisions, as Bill said, not to force you to go with their recommendations. We've said this a few times now. Ask officers their opinion before you vote. As we heard, that's good to do before a meeting, just to clarify. Sometimes watching planning committees, which I do, because it's part of the job, but it's also interesting. What really kind of can undermine confidence to the public who don't know your area or don't know the kind of issues that kind of like might be involved is when a councillor on a committee says, excuse me, what about X, Y, and Z? And the officer says, oh yeah, that's paragraph 4 on page 10. And it just suggests that, you've naturally read the report. You've got to be able to show that you've read the report and understand it. And you are allowed to ask, we've heard, additional questions, but it's above and beyond that demonstrate your deeper understanding and your desire to really get to grips with the issues that really will give that confidence and help you come to the best decision. And as it said on the slide, if you are going to overturn a recommendation, you can ask officers for their opinion on what the implications of that before you vote. Some reports and some officers are very clear when they're making a recommendation in their report that it is finely balanced, and therefore they actually welcome your input to help come to that decision. Other applications are much more in line or conform with an opted policy, so they are more straightforward. So just a little bit about managing meetings and how this works out in the dynamics of a committee meeting as well. So when the committee has reached a different balance of material considerations to what the officers' report is a recommendation, officers can be asked to explain to the committee in black and white terms before a motion is made. You can ask, say, which issues raised in our discussion this evening or this afternoon can be given the greatest weight and which cannot. You know, what conditions, reasons are likely to be found reasonable? If we are going to refuse this application, what is our strongest basis for making that decision? But again, we need to be aware that as these are public sessions, it's often better to do that beforehand, so you kind of aware of these issues. I mean, and just on that point as well, there can be a whole range of reasons that you identify for refusing an application against officer recommendations. But if you do have to go to appeal, it can become very expensive if you're relying on reasons that really can't be evidenced and aren't material, and officers can offer you that advice on what are the most important ones in planning terms that enable us to justify that decision. And I have been, you know, I've worked with local authorities who have refused an application, and when it comes to appeal, 4 out of 5 reasons for appeal were just dismissed or just dropped straight away by the authority because they knew that they wouldn't stand up when they got in front of the planning inspector. And that really then generates costs for the local authority, who might have to cover the costs of the applicant for basically costing them a lot of time and money and wasting their time. It's those kind of things that, as Bill said, we've got to have in the back of our mind.
Gareth, it's worth pointing out there that we had one a few years ago which we turned down, and we had the very unusual situation that the council won the appeal but had costs awarded against us because we had one killer reason that couldn't be overcome, but the committee made the mistake of putting 5 or 6 other, I won't say silly, but very, very minor reasons that could easily be batted off at the appeal. So the inspector ruled that the applicant couldn't have planning permission because of the one killer reason, but had their costs awarded in their favour because they'd had to take the time to defend 5 or 6 silly reasons. So it comes back to the representations from the public. One good reason is always better than loads and loads of silly minor reasons. So it's an important thing, I think, to bear in mind.
That's really, I'd not heard of that. That's quite an achievement, that, isn't it, really? And that's...
Well, I'm not saying we're proud of it, but
no.
It is quite an unusual one, yeah.
But it's similar to what we were talking about when we talked about, you know, objections from the public, isn't it? One really good, strong objection is worth a lot more than a letter signed by a petition of hundreds of people. You know, it's the quality, not the quantity. That's the thing about the planning that I find really important, but can be difficult to explain to general members of the public. Thank you, but that's a really good example. Sorry, I'm not done this slide. I think just to talk about evidence then, and what is good and what is bad. And this is, you know, this can relate to, you know, flooding, like we were talking about earlier. Just how precise and accurate can you be when you're using evidence to help you make a decision like this? Because it will be challenged. So, you know, housing density is much higher than the surrounding area. That might be the case, but how strong is that for refusing an application? So the X's there, they represent the kind of cross-examination point that could be put to a witness in a public local inquiry, or that will be asked by the inspector if it's in written representations and hearing cases. So, you know, it can, what do you mean by the surrounding area? What is higher and how much exactly? And what does that really matter? What is the harm that comes from that? Similarly as well, you know, it's about the change of use is unsociable and will cause a disturbance to local residents. Well, what do you mean by disturbance? Where is the evidence to back this up? What are you basing that on? Has the applicant provided any consultant reports, and can they be challenged much more accurately? You know, what are the hours of operation? When does disturbance happen? What do we mean by unsociable? Is it after 10 o'clock because it's in a residential area where families live? Or if it's in Manchester city centre, could be 2 o'clock in the morning becomes unsociable. It's very different in different areas. And finally, as well, you know, the site is a considerable distance from local facilities and the bus service is poor. You've got areas that I'm sure could come under that description in your part of the world. But what local facilities do we mean exactly? How far is a considerable distance? And what is the bus service? Let's get some facts and figures in here. So they're what we might call examples of bad evidence. But the same issues, the very same points, can be explained in a much stronger way for planning and in a much more verifiable way as well. It's about using fact and informed and reasonable commentary. So that point about density, you know, actually say what the net density of the scheme is and how that contrasts to the area around it. And yes, you can use a term like, in my opinion, in the opinion of the committee, this discrepancy, whilst perhaps not conclusive, is an indication of just how incompatible what is being proposed is to our area. That's a much stronger way of putting the same point. Similar that point about unsociable hours and noise and neighbour nuisance. The consultant's report, so actually referring to a document that has been submitted as part of the application, the consultant's report claims that noise will not impact on residents, but the hours of operation do extend to 10 p.m. and there's family housing in the area. Noise complaints from businesses, other premises in the town has led to action being taken by environmental health. So actually referring to examples of this issue from your local area can be quite powerful as well. And similarly, that point about distance from local amenities and facilities, the nearest primary school, or whether it's shop or doctor's surgery or whatever, is XX miles away. It's an unlit road with no footway. It's very unlikely anyone would make the journey on foot. The bus service is running twice a day and not on a weekend. You can actually verify that. So that makes it a much stronger point. So what we're saying now, and we come into a wrap up. Committee, I hope this isn't an insulting slide actually, because you would never come to committee with an empty mind, I'm sure. But come to committee with an open mind, willing and kind of open to hear and discuss, as we've said. You are there as jurors, but you can come and you should come, you know, with your own ideas and with your own questions and expectations. So it's not an empty mind, but you do have to be open to points of view and contrary to those that you might hold. And just in summary, we've used these terms a lot now already, but you know, the key point, it's about reasonableness and balancing material consideration. So just to summarise, you're taking decisions on behalf of the whole community, not just your ward or not just the noisiest people who are making the most objections. Consistency is expected. Precedents do count. We have to look at every case individually, but the way you made a decision in the past is material and will have a bearing. I mean, I watched a committee where you made a really interesting decision about rebuilding what was a derelict house in open countryside against officer recommendations. And, you know, it was a really interesting debate. And I can understand why you came to that. That kind of decision will have implications for how you have to judge similar cases in future. And it's understanding that, as Bill said, looking ahead as well as looking what's in front of you is so important. So that presumption, the presumption is in favour of development or sustainable development. We need to keep reminding ourselves that. We need to keep explaining that to our constituents and our colleagues, maybe in other parts of the council. And the officer report sets out material considerations and a recommendation. But what if your balance is different to the recommendations? Are you taking advice and will you discuss this and your reasons in advance? That's a really helpful thing to do, you know, so that you're able to come to the best decision. So takeaway tips: follow the codes of conduct, follow the kind of code of conduct that we've talked about and what's expected. Start with the development plan. It's your starting point. It's a reference point that you've got. Take everything that's relevant into account, and we know what relevance means now when we talk about material considerations. Seek advice from officers, planning officers, but also legal officers in how you conduct yourselves in meetings, and carefully consider the evidence that you're using to improve. I suppose what that last point is making is carefully consider the evidence that might be needed, that you're using to make a decision, as that could be needed later on down the line to make to defend a decision at appeal. And finally, reach a decision that a reasonable decision maker would make, properly directed. I mean, that sounds easy, doesn't it? But you know, it's about it's kind of basically got legal weight. That if you refuse, make sure you have sound planning reasons which are reasonable. And interestingly as well, and this is what not every committee does, go back over some of the results of your previous decisions, because that can really help inform and improve what you do in the future as well. And as local members, you're around, you can see, like we were hearing earlier about flooding, the mistakes of previous decisions. How do we avoid those in the future? And we should all be doing that when we're in planning, because we have that benefit of seeing how things have actually turned out on the ground as well. So we're just about coming to the end. In your pack, you'll see this slide. I just wanted to include this because planning's like any other profession, isn't it? Once you get the jargon right, you can sound a lot more credible. But it's your job, you know, and maybe as planners, we have some of the best acronyms in the world, don't we, in planning? And we do rely on them a lot. And you as members sometimes have to explain these things in real life, everyday English to your constituents. So it's helpful for you to understand all these different acronyms and jargons as well. And I must admit, as we said earlier, I'm really looking forward to coming back down, I think 16th of July, to actually do what we might call a case study in practice and apply some of these issues and some of these principles, some of these lessons on an actual case. So that's something where Bill will come up to Plymouth, we'll be in the room together and actually role play a committee decision for an application that has been kind of, that is a real life application that took place in a different part of the country, and we'll work through it to see what decision you come to and how that compared to the decision that the actual local authority who made that decision came to. Okay, thank you.
So we can study it?
Yes, absolutely. So what we'll do, I was just talking to Adrian before we started, we'll be role playing. So some of us will play the role of case officer. Some of us will play the role of experts, like could be from the lead local flood authority or the environment agency. You'll play the role of planning committee, but we'll share with you a planning report as you would get in your normal pack, suitably anonymised. It's in a town called Ford Town Centre, that you will then read and treat as you would any other planning application. We will be asking for a few volunteers as well. So any members who aren't on the committee, we need a volunteer to ask to speak against as an objector, and you'll be given a bit of advice and a script to do that, and also someone to speak for the scheme as well, so that you as a committee get a chance to ask them questions as you would in any of the planning committee. Brilliant. Any final questions, please? That's the date I've got. Oh, good. So it's in your diary already. Oh, fantastic! If it's in your Outlook diary, it happens, doesn't it? That's right. Thank you. No, are there any more questions? No. Can I thank you for your time? It's been really interesting. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. So I'll say.
Sorry,
thank you to
just
the people
to clarify,
online.
planning committee will be on the 23rd of July and the training sessions on the 16th. The other thing to actually tell you is that you will be receiving these things very shortly, the white diary pages.
Thanks, Alan. And thank you to the people online as well. I think we've had a couple of people listening online, as well as Councillor Stevens. Thanks for joining us, Bill, and look forward to seeing you in real life next month. He's not artificial intelligence creator. We're very short of good planners, and I do
not sure about that, Gareth, but we'll do our best.
Can I just quickly say thank you to Gareth and Rachel from PAS, and also Councillor Stevens, who's online, obviously. And thanks all for your time. I know that a lot of hopefully, a lot of what's been talked about today isn't new, but I think it is important to reflect outside of the heat, if you like, of a committee meeting, you know, the roles that we each have. If I can just briefly, a couple of things that I think are really important takeaways. The fact that the local plan is up to date is a good position for us to be in. You know, we start from a position of much greater strength than a lot of authorities. But that does mean the primacy of the local plan is a really key consideration. So when we're looking at sites that are allocated, you know, we need to be given significant weight to that. And you will see from officers' reports that we do in those scenarios. But I do also want to highlight this point about collaborative working, and I would just emphasise that fire as many questions as you want at officers in planning committee. I think it's really important that we have a healthy debate and discussion about that. I would highlight Gareth's point that we aren't personally attached to the recommendations, other than the heartache sometimes of having to get a report together, which I have the luxury of not doing anymore. But you know, it's not a personal recommendation, it's a professional one. It's there to be scrutinised in a healthy sense, in that there will always be debates, as Gareth talked about, and as you already know, most issues in planning, there are two sides to the story. So it's about getting to that reasonable point that Councillor Stevens talked about particularly well, I think, in that whatever the recommendation and where we start from, if the debate is focused on planning material considerations, how you've interpreted policy, and evidence that may well be there that potentially does contradict what some of the consultees are saying, or recognise of the fact that there might be a different way of balancing that evidence to how officers have done it, that's absolutely fine. But we don't want to be in a position where that is adversarial, one-sided, and doesn't involve questioning, because where we've clearly gone through that questioning process, it will be clear to members of the public, and it was talked about earlier about the inspectorate, there'll be a clear record of how we've got to this decision we've got to, and that can only be a benefit to local residents, and also this issue of consistency and how we actually benefit from the position of having a strong local plan. That does give us a strength, but we have to make decisions in accordance with it unless there's very clear evidence to indicate otherwise. So without wishing to lecture, I think just an important point to emphasise, but I think it's been a really useful, hopefully you have found it useful, from my point of view, useful training session. And it's a complicated job, you know, being members of planning committee. Obviously, I can only talk about it from an officer perspective, but you know, we understand these are difficult scenarios. As Gareth said, most applications that come to committee, they're not the easy ones. They're contentious applications where that balance is all the more tricky. So you know, we absolutely do understand that, and as I say, my plea would be that we exercise the role in a collaborative way, and that please recognise that officers are here to help in those respects. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Nobody's got any further questions. I think call it to a close.